Hey everybody, I hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy. Today's lecture about color in the landscape is in two parts. The first part, part one, covers the classes of plant material that we use to provide color in the landscape, and part two discusses planting bed preparation and the use of spacing guides. So anyway, two-part lecture series. Hope you enjoy it.
Annuals, biennials, and perennials. These are the three broad classifications of plant material that we can use for color. Let's take a look at this image that you see on the screen. So on the top you have the life cycle of an annual plant. So an annual plant, by definition, is a plant that survives for a single growing season. Generally, these plants are started from seed. They grow, they flower, they produce fruit-bearing seed, and then at the end of their growing season, they're genetically programmed to die. All right, skipping down to the bottom, that is the life cycle of a biennial plant. By definition, biennial plants survive for 2 growing seasons. In their first growing season, the seeds will germinate. Vegetative growth will occur, but no flowers are formed in the first growing season. At the end of the first growing season, the plant has some strategy for surviving winter, generally as some sort of modified root or stem underground. And in the second growing season, the vegetative growth resumes, flowering occurs, and then finally fruits are produced that bear seeds. At the end of 2 growing seasons, the plant is genetically programmed to die, and that'll be the end of the biennial plant. Now, both annuals and biennials can start again from whatever seed they produce, but those plants that come from seed were not the original plants that you planted. And then finally, we'll finish with perennial plants in the middle of the screen. So by definition, a perennial plant is a plant that can survive for 3 or more growing seasons. So it may take a few years for a perennial to get to the point in its life cycle where it can flower. But once it starts to flower, then it usually continues to flower every growing season from there on. How do perennials come back? Well, perennial plants form buds on stems, and the growth is resumed each spring from those buds. Warm season annual plants are annual plants as we just described in the previous slide, and Angelonia is an example of a warm season annual plant that we could grow in Texas. Another example that comes to mind would be rose periwinkle, which is Catharanthus roseus. So these are plants that we could put out in our yards, generally starting sometime around the end of March or the beginning of April, and we can keep them in our yards up through probably about the end of September. So they're going to provide color from April through September in our yards. After September, when the temperatures start to cool off, we generally dig up these warm season annuals and replace them with cool season annuals. Okay, this is an example of a cool season annual plant, snapdragon. So this is something that we could grow in Texas from about late September all the way through March, for example. Some other plants that fall into this cool season annual category would include things like viola and pansy. Those are 2 classic plants that would be considered cool season annuals in Texas. A foliage annual would be a plant like coleus. So coleus is an annual plant. Coleus does flower, but we generally don't grow coleus for its flowers. In fact, a lot of people will cut the flowers off. We grow coleus because of its variegated leaves. So there are many different cultivars of coleus, and there's many different variations in leaf texture, leaf shape, and leaf coloration. So Coleus would be a great example of a foliage annual. The biennial plants are a little bit harder to find. It took me a lot of work just to come up with a couple examples of biennial plants that we can grow here in Texas. I know a lot of vegetables are biennials, but it was hard to find flowering plants that were biennials. The one example that I did come up with is biennial foxglove. So we talked about biennials earlier, so these are plants that do not flower in their first growing season, but will flower in their second growing season. And at the end of the second growing season, they're going to die back. Now, they may come back from any seed that was produced before they die. Gayfeather is an example of a herbaceous perennial plant. Let's look at the word herbaceous. Herbaceous refers to plants that lack or do not have a persistent woody above ground stem. And the term perennial, as we already know, refers to plants that survive for 3 or more years. So a herbaceous perennial plant is something that we can put in our yards for color. The plants will flower either spring, summer, or fall, depending upon the species and cultivar. At the end of the growing season, when the temperatures cool off, the foliage will die back and the plant will survive underground, usually as a modified stem or root. And then the following spring, the plants will resume growth. So they keep repeating this cycle for many, many years. Another example of a herbaceous perennial would be salvia. There are several species and many cultivars of salvia that we use for color. This is an example of a woody perennial. So this is a shrub. The common name is heavenly bamboo. The genus for this particular shrub is Nandina. So this is a plant that is perennial, so it survives for 3 or more growing seasons. It does flower, and it'll come back every year from buds that are formed on the stems. Daffodils are examples of bulbous perennial plants. If you wanted to grow daffodils in your yard, you would purchase bulbs in the fall. That's when they would be available at garden centers or online. And you would plant the bulbs in the fall, probably somewhere around 4 to 6 inches deep. The bulbs would overwinter in the ground, and then the following spring, when the soil temperature started to warm up, the bulbs would begin to push out a shoot that would bear leaves and eventually flowers. As the growing season continues, the leaves, which would be photosynthesizing, are making a lot of sugar, and those sugars are going to be stored as carbohydrates in the scales of new bulblets or offset bulbs that form from the basal plate of the original bulb that you planted in the fall. So offset bulbs are just a way for daffodils and other bulbous perennial plants to repropagate themselves. These are some of the valuable characteristics to consider when designing with flowers. Flowers provide a very strong focal point in the landscape. Flowers may sometimes be fragrant, which just adds to their beauty. Some flowers may attract birds and butterflies, which may be something your clients are interested in. Flowers can soften harsh lines, and we'll talk more about this in a second. And flowers can suggest changing seasons. So we've already discussed warm season annuals and cool season annuals. So looking at warm season annuals during the summer and then transitioning to the cool season annuals in fall and winter can suggest the changing of seasons in the landscape. And finally, whenever doing any design work with flowering plants, use them in mass. So never just plant one or two in a location, plant several. And the more you put together in a bed, the greater the flower display is going to be. In terms of a focal point, you can see that this fountain has some petunias planted around it, and the flowers really draw your eye to the fountain and create a focal point. In this case, you have flowers that are bordering a hedge, and they sort of provide a focal point to that garden gate that you see in the distance. So basically they just kind of invite you to look at the flowers and then kind of pass through that area onto the gate. Buddleia, or the butterfly bush, is a woody perennial plant that attracts butterflies. Just a bit ago, we talked about how flowers can soften hard borders. So in this situation, you have a sidewalk that was created using square pavers, which is a very hard surface. And then alongside that, you have a flower bed that is softening the border of that hard surface. Like I mentioned earlier, more is always better when designing with flowers, when designing with color. So always mass plant flowering plants so that you get maximum effect. There are differences between flower beds and flower borders. So what you see pictured here is a flower bed. Flower beds can be viewed from all sides and have no background foliage. When designing flower beds, always put the tallest plants in the center of the bed, and the shortest plants will be around the perimeter of the flower bed. This picture illustrates a flower border. Borders have more limited viewing opportunities. They also have some type of background. Now the background of a flower border could be a building like the house you see pictured here, or the background could be a hedge or something like that. When planting flower borders, the tallest plants are always going to be placed in the background. The mid-sized plants more or less in the middle of the flower border, and the shortest plants will be closest to the edge of the flower border. Naturalizing with daffodils. So as you look at this picture, you see daffodils in flower in the spring, but they're not located in a planting bed or border. The plants are just integrated into the entire landscape, in this case, perhaps a yard or someone's lawn. Naturalizing is something that we accomplish with bulbous perennial plants like daffodils, for example, but it's important to know that not every species of bulbous perennial plant is suited to naturalizing. There are many species and types of Narcissus, which is the genus for daffodils, including what we commonly know as daffodils, jonquils, and paper whites. As a general rule, the larger the flower a narcissus has, the less adapted it will be to naturalizing. The smaller flower types and the clustered flower types are the easier and more permanent plants for naturalizing. Another general rule that applies is that only the early blooming types of daffodils or narcissus are truly adapted for naturalizing. All right, I mentioned just a bit ago that not every species of bulbous perennial is suited for use in naturalizing, but I wanted to share with you a little research that I did on some plants that will and are able to grow in Texas that are suitable for naturalizing if that's something that you're interested in trying. So one species of tulip that I discovered is called the Texas tulip, Tulipa praecox, and it is a spring flowering tulip that is suited for naturalizing. This is an autumn crocus, Sternbergia lutea, so it flowers in the fall. So one thing you always kind of have to keep in mind is if you're naturalizing a area that's in turf grass, the reason that you want something that blooms early is because at some point you're going to have to start mowing that turf grass. So you want to be able to see those flowers before you have to start mowing. Or in the case of the species that we see pictured here, maybe by the time autumn crocus flowers, we're done mowing. So we can enjoy the flower display without having to worry about going out, mowing the yard, and potentially cutting off those flowers. There are two different methods that we can use for starting annuals in the landscape. The first method is called direct seeding. The second method would involve planting bedding plants, purchasing and planting bedding plants. So let's take a look at direct seeding. So in this method, you're going to be purchasing seed. So you can do this either mail order or by going to a garden center. Generally, you're going to have a wide variety of seeds that you can pick from. If you're going to direct seed in the landscape, you're going to have to prepare a bed ahead of time. So the soil has to be prepared, which means it probably needs to be cultivated, rototilled, prepared in that manner. Purchasing seed is inexpensive. So when you buy a packet of seed, maybe you get 50 or 100 seeds, it doesn't really cost you that much to propagate annual plants using the direct seeding method. A wide selection of seed would be available through your garden centers or through mail order companies online. It takes more time because you're starting the plants from seed, so they have to grow and become old enough to start to flower. You will also need to do some thinning. So when you sow the seed, you're going to be broadcasting the seed on the surface of the soil that you previously prepared. As those seeds germinate, chances are some of those seedlings are going to be too close together, and you're going to have to manually go out there and thin them out so that they have a little bit more space to grow. Okay, weather is probably the biggest uncertainty, the biggest risk factor when doing direct seeding. And it's really no different than if you were seeding your yard. So many landscaping companies have seeded yards only to have tremendous downpour of rain occur maybe an hour or two after the seeding was completed and wash all that seed away. Well, the same thing can happen with annual direct seeding in prepared beds. There's always the risk that a thunderstorm, heavy rain may wash that seeding or those seeds away, and then you have to start the process over again. The second method of getting annual bedding plants started is to purchase the bedding plants from a garden center. So bedding plants that garden centers buy are started in greenhouses. So in greenhouses, probably sometime in January or February, they're beginning to sow seeds into cell packs. They're going to be more expensive. The reason for that is somebody did the growing for you and you're buying a more finished plant, an older plant. Another advantage to purchasing bedding plants is when you buy them in 6-packs, you're getting an older plant that's going to probably have a better chance of survival than maybe a young seedling. Selection of bedding plants may be more limited because you're going to be restricted to whatever the garden center has for sale. You control the spacing, so you can plant the individual bedding plants 4 inches apart, 5 inches apart, 6 inches apart, 8 inches apart, whatever you decide is the best spacing for that particular species. You control the spacing. And finally, there's no thinning required. Because you spaced them at the distance that you want, you don't have to come back and thin like you would with young seedlings. And generally speaking, you're going to get more predictable results. The plants in those cell packs are going to be bigger. They generally transplant very well and become established very, very quickly. All right, so this ends part 1 of 2. Thanks for watching.